Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this conference, and I always feel it's such a privilege to be invited to come and present to peers. You did get all that right, that was fine. It was fine because I wrote it, and now I'm embarrassed to hear it all read back in public. It's funny, you sit in your study and you write this stuff to try and impress people, and then you realise how unimpressive it is. Okay, so what we're going to, I've changed slightly the title of the talk. What I'd like to call it is "We're already researchers, we just don't realise it." It's just a slight change, but it works in my head. The meeting room in central London was small and airless, and there were just a few too many bodies to allow the space to feel anything other than cramped. Nonetheless, the bodies that filled the room were engaged in a discussion that fired strongly held, if respectfully expressed, opinions. It was the mid-noughties, and the room that I squeezed myself into in St Thomas's Hospital was filled with others attending a regional gathering of the College of Healthcare Chaplains. The speaker for the meeting was Canon Dr. Simon Harrison, currently the college president, but at the time the editor of the college journal. He was speaking about research, which at that point was a relatively new area of interest within the profession, as indeed was the idea that it might be appropriate to consider our profession a profession. In the discussion that followed Simon's talk, the room was split. On the one hand, there were chaplains who felt that research was going to be an important aspect of chaplaincy's emerging professional agenda. And on the other hand, there were chaplains who said that research had not been part of the ministry that they had signed up to. In particular, I remember one colleague saying that all he wanted to do was to be with people who were sick and dying and represent the love of Christ to them in their time of need. Now, it's very hard not to be sympathetic with that view. Why else did we come into chaplaincy if not to be supportive of vulnerable people and to try to help make their unbearable experience slightly less unbearable? And yet the healthcare world that we signed up to has changed. Actually, it had already changed by the time most of us signed our first contract with a healthcare provider. That change has been continuous, and it's most salient in two socio-cultural developments. In the broadest sense, there's the ongoing development of secularisation, the holding frame in which there's been what Charles Taylor describes as a move from a society where belief in God is unchallenged and indeed unproblematic, to one in which it's understood to be one option among others and frequently not the easiest to embrace. Implicit within that rationalist scientific frame, there is a demand for evidence, which in our field in its turn led to the development of evidence-based healthcare culture. In this presentation, I want to concentrate on the implications for chaplaincy of evidence-based healthcare culture. So the language and the culture of this evidence-based practice is now so much a part of the healthcare environment that it seems incongruous to realise that the concept of evidence-based medicine was introduced as recently as 1991. In fact, David Sackett and his colleagues from the universities of Macalester in Ontario, Canada, and Oxford, England, who pioneered the concept, observed in 1996 that evidence-based medicine was considered a hot topic for clinicians, public health practitioners, purchasers, planners, and the public. Now, whether or not the arguments in favour of evidence-based medicine has been fully accepted, and the concept does still have its critics, it seems that, at least as far as the healthcare culture is concerned, the arguments are settled. So when in 2008 Lord Darcy published the final report of his NHS review, His use of the word evidence, which characterised the report, seemed natural and unremarkable. The point is that while some colleagues may want simply to be with people who are sick and dying and simply represent the love of Christ to those people in their time of need, our employers, those people who commission and pay for our services, want to be sure that it is a measurable health benefit associated with being with vulnerable people, and a health benefit which is worth continuing to include in their budgets. Now, the wake-up call for many of us came during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's been made explicit in the research conducted by Austin Snowden during this period. As the head of nursing at Edinburgh Napier University and lead researcher for the European Research Institute in Healthcare Chaplaincy in Leuven in Belgium, Snowden is a friend of chaplaincy. During May and June 2020, as the first waves of the pandemic were crashing into our nursing homes and across our news media, and as hospitalisations and deaths from the disease were increasing at an alarming rate, Snowden launched an online survey of healthcare chaplains across Europe, the USA and Australia. In all, over 1,600 chaplains responded from 36 countries. And what Snowden's survey made clear was that while some chaplains were applauded as heroes along with their fellow health colleagues, others were seen as little more than an infection risk. Because while some chaplains were viewed as essential employees by their organisations, most of us were not. And what's significant, I think, about Snowden's survey is that it shows, on the whole, that a substantial proportion of chaplains remain as outsiders. Snowden himself suggests that the reasons why our profession is so sidelined during the worst health crisis in living memory include a lack of chaplain leadership, a degree of organisational misunderstanding about the nature of chaplain's role, and perhaps surprisingly, a fundamental lack of clarity and confidence among chaplains themselves about the meaning of our role. I say surprisingly, although perhaps it's not really that surprising, because the pandemic broke during the period that the profession has been trying to figure out what form it should take, given that the healthcare world in which chaplaincy operates is now so very different to the one that most of us, if not all of us, thought we were signing up to. Indeed, in the last 15 years, has produced numerous studies that in one way or another have investigated the question of what it is that chaplains do. And this is the point. The reason why a substantial proportion of chaplains remain or experience themselves as outsiders is because professionally we're uncertain about our identity. It's confusion that's been generated, at least in part, I would suggest, by the shift towards evidence-based culture within healthcare. It's this shift that has left chaplains unable to explain to our chaplaincy leaders, our managers, in ways that they can understand who it is that we are and what it is that we do. And the result has been the organisational misunderstanding of our role that Snowden highlights. A misunderstanding that has led to our experiencing ourselves as outsiders within our own organisations. Of course, some chaplains welcome the idea of being an outsider. They welcome this outsider status because it endorses their narrative, the rationale that chaplains inhabit this liminal space that informs their ability to empathise with patients' experience. And I don't have an argument with that perspective, except to say that these chaplains may find comfort in this affirmation of their guiding narrative. It will be hard for them to justify the salaries if their managers continue to view them as organisational outsiders. If we believe that chaplaincy and spiritual care has value for patients beyond our own careers, then the solution is not to retreat into the kinds of self-soothing narrative self-soothing narrative spinning that confirms our professional isolation. The solution is to learn to speak the language that chaplaincy managers understand, which is the language of evidence-based care. And we can learn to speak that language by becoming research literate. My aim in this presentation is not to persuade us all to become researchers, but to at least become research literate. So as I discovered in that College of Healthcare Chaplains meeting in central London, suggesting that chaplains should engage with empirical research can fire passionately held opinions and possibly a degree of anxiety. For many of us, research can be a word that induces anxiety. And yet if we take a step back and try to reframe the concept of research, we quickly discover that research, or at least the research process, is something that we're already very familiar with. Research is in fact something that we actively engage in almost every day of our lives. And that's because research is simply another word for finding stuff out. So imagine for a moment that you need to get a new smartphone. How do you go about it? Well, what you probably won't do is go down to the nearest smartphone warehouse and buy the first shiny new phone that catches your eye. A smartphone typically costs quite a lot of money, so you will want to make sure that you choose wisely and find the right smartphone for you. One that will do all the things that you need it to at a price that you can afford. So how do you find that stuff out? Well, what you might do is look at what's already known about smartphones. You might read the product information supplied by the various smartphone manufacturers, but you might also want to find some more objective opinions. You might read consumer reports. You might go online to see what reviewers have to say about smartphones that they've tested. You might even read those old-fashioned paper reviews by consumer organisations such as Which. So far, so good. You've got a reasonable idea of the kind of stuff that's out there and what more you need to know. But you've also found out that the smartphone market is a big field and you need to narrow down your research, your area of interest. You might actually have certain things in mind that you need from your smartphone. You need to have a good camera, be compatible with a wide selection of apps, have a good service coverage in your area, be an Android phone. You might want it to come within a certain budget. So still with the idea that you're looking for the right smartphone for you, you want to gather accurate and unbiased information about the phones that you're interested in. You might consider several options. You might talk to people who've bought and used the phones that you're interested in. And if you're a very systematic person, when you talk to these people, you might keep a count. You might see how many use a Samsung, how many use an iPhone, how many use an Oppo, and how many use Nokia. You might also note on a scale of 1 to 5 how they rate their particular phone, and you might even find out from them which service provider they use and how their rates compare. And having gathered all the information that you think you want, you might set out to what you've found and think through the pros and cons of what you've discovered. And having done all that, you come to your decision about your smartphone, and if you've still got any energy left, you'll go down to the smartphone warehouse and put in your order. So the question now then is, how does finding stuff out about the smartphone relate to research? Well, the answer is that you've actually simply walked through each of the steps of the research process. You started off with the problem. You needed to find a new smartphone that was right for you. And this is the stuff that you wanted to find out about. Put in the language of research, this was your research problem. Just needing to get a new smartphone is too general a problem, because actually any old smartphone would fit that problem. So that's why you focused in on the stuff that you wanted to find out and asked the question, what is the most suitable smartphone for me? And with that you developed your research question. Then you started to read around and find out what's already known about smartphones. The product information, the consumer report, the online literature. And this is much the same as the literature review that researchers conduct, because a literature review is a systematic read-through of what other people already have found out about the field. In your case, what's already known about smartphones. In a researcher's case, what's already known about good spiritual care, with people who have chronic heart failure, for example. Now, it's not possible to investigate every smartphone. The market's too big, so that's why you narrowed down your area of interest. Researchers call this sampling. It isn't possible to investigate an entire population, so researchers try to study a representative sample of that large group. Popping down to Smartphone Warehouse to see what they have on offer would be like a researcher taking a convenience sample. The warehouse is conveniently nearby, and they have a convenient collection of smartphones that you can study. But usually researchers are interested in specific things. So like you, they have their inclusion criteria. Your inclusion criteria are things like the phone should have a good camera, it should be compatible with a wide selection of apps, and so on. The researcher's inclusion criteria might be things like people with a diagnosis of chronic heart failure, people within a certain age range, people who are able to read English. And when you settle on your chosen way to gather your information that you wanted, this became... Sorry, I'm pressing the wrong button here. This became your research methodology, your way to gather research. Talking to people with experience of the smartphones that you're interested in is a form of qualitative research, involving a kind of semi-structured interviewing. By contrast, taking a more systematic approach and numerically recording how many people use particular models of smartphone would be quantitative research, involving a type of survey, possibly using something called Likert scales. And having found out all the stuff that you could about the potential choice of smartphone, you had to figure out which phone answered your research question. So you set out your findings and you did your analysis, and eventually you concluded your research and put in your order. So my point here is simple, that research and the research process are not things that we are entirely unfamiliar with, because research is about finding stuff out. Finding stuff out about smartphones is much the same as finding stuff out about spiritual care, or about drug therapies, or any of 1,000 other things that we might want to research. It's a process that we're very familiar with because it's a process that's already part of our everyday lives. And obviously there's a degree of technical rigour that's involved in academic research, which would be unnecessary for the everyday stuff of finding stuff out. In the academic context, the rigour is necessary to ensure that the findings are accurate and in most cases generalisable. And the methodologies are so detailed in order that the findings can be replicated by other researchers to test out the results. But the rigour of an academic paper only underlines the fact that the research is already familiar to us, the research process, because the structure of every academic research paper follows the same research process. It identifies the research problem, which it states as a research question. It provides a literature review that explains what's already known and makes clear why this study is important and necessary, where the gaps in knowledge are. It describes the research sample, the nature of its representation and its inclusion and exclusion criteria, and it gives detailed accounts of the researcher's chosen methodology, together with why they chose that methodology and not a different one. And finally, the paper sets out the research findings, often in the form of tables and charts which elucidate and expand on the findings, and it represents the researcher's analysis and ends with a conclusion that explains how adequately the research problem has been addressed. And then finally, the paper will list the references in case you wanted to follow up anything that interested you. So the reality is that the colleagues at the College of Healthcare Chaplains meeting in London, who said that research was not part of the ministry of representing the love of Christ to people who were sick and dying, wasn't part of what they'd signed up for, needn't have been so concerned. The fact is that engaging with research is first of all about trying to ensure that our professional practice is as effective as we can possibly make it for the people for whom we care. And after that, It's about trying to ensure that our care is understood within the evidence-based healthcare culture is the contemporary context in which we work. So we're already halfway there. We've discovered that we are already very familiar with the basics of the research process. What we need to do now is become familiar with the research itself. And the way to do that is perhaps obvious. We need to find good quality, relevant research, and we need to learn how to read it with a degree of understanding. So there are several ways that we can begin finding and accessing good research. To begin with, if you happen to be a member of the College of Healthcare Chaplains, then you'll know that as part of your membership you have free access to the internationally respected peer-reviewed journal Health and Social Care Chaplaincy. The journal is published twice yearly and regularly features original empirical research along with papers reflecting on professional practice. The current issue includes a qualitative study that uses semi-structured interviews with hospital chaplains in Sweden to investigate the extent to which chaplains meet the expectations of staff and patients. There's a systematized review of the literature on healthcare chaplaincy, spiritual care interventions that support adult mental health by integrating health and social care. And there's a study exploring the impact of values-based effective practice as a reflective tool amongst undergraduate medical students. It's worth pointing out that although access to the papers is restricted to members of the college, on occasions Health and Social Care Chaplaincy, along with other healthcare journals, healthcare chaplaincy journals, make some of the articles available as an open access, in other words, a free license. So it's worth checking out the websites of the Journal of Healthcare Chaplaincy, which is the American journal, the Journal of Religion and Health, which usually has quite a few free articles, and the Journal of Pastoral Care and Counselling. These are the four main journals that have an immediate relevance to chaplaincy and that publish good quality, original empirical research. And to make life even easier, I collate the UK Chaplains Research Digest, and there are copies of it on the table where you're sitting. This is a quarterly news sheet that provides a snapshot of current research across these journals, and that highlights any articles that are open access. The digest is available as a free download on the research page of the college website, and so you can get the back issues if you would like to. If you're relatively new to reading empirical research, you might welcome an introduction that grades accessibility of papers. So Transforming Chaplaincy is a US-based organisation dedicated to developing research literacy. The organisation's website, which is transformingchaplaincy.org, is a rich resource for research and includes a page of recommended starter readings with a link to a page of next steps articles and additional pages of recommendations of key research in content-specific areas, including palliative and end-of-life care. Transforming Chaplaincy is not able to provide access to these papers, but your institutional librarians will be very likely to get access to those papers for you. However, if you prefer to have your research articles delivered in book form, Evidence-Based Healthcare Chaplaincy is a research reader curated by chaplains associated with Transforming Chaplaincy. The editors not only introduce research that's accessible to readers new to reading empirical studies. As the title suggests, the papers provide readers with evidence-based insights that have real-world application for practice. An indirect way to access good, relevant research is via the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education research website. This site has several pages of interest, but the standout pages are the ACPE's Research Article of the Month. And this is well worth bookmarking and reviewing each month. So So every month since September 2002, John Ehrman, chaplaincy manager at Penn Presbyterian Medical Center in Philadelphia, has been highlighting research articles that he considers to be of special interest. He intends that these articles will encourage discussion among chaplains to suggest potential resources for further investigation. As with transforming chaplaincy, Ehrman doesn't provide access to the actual papers. He does provide detailed summaries, very detailed summaries, with comment on each paper, along with links to articles of related interest. The Article of the Month page is just an invaluable trove of support for engaging with up-to-date, good quality empirical research on a wide range of aspects relevant to chaplaincy and spiritual care. So, for example, in September 2019, Ehrman highlighted a paper that presents an evidence-based model for spiritual assessments specific to adult palliative care. This happens to be open access, so if you look that up, you can read the document. With his summary, he adds links to the abstracts of papers that detail Monod's spiritual distress assessment tool, which you may or may not be familiar with, as well as papers on spiritual pain and religious and spiritual struggle. And finally, in terms of finding research, for anyone who wants to find their own research articles, the recently launched NHS Knowledge and Library Hub is a one-stop shop for UK-based researchers and readers of evidence-based research. The site is intuitive to use, and its guidance and resource pages has a helpful video, tutorial and downloadable user guide. It's only just been launched. I'm not familiar with it myself, but I have had a look at it, and it does look very good. The hub offers basic, advanced and PICO search options, as well as the facility to search individual databases. Of course, it's one thing to read empirical research, it's perhaps another thing to read it with a level of understanding. And again, there are some, I have to say not many, but some useful resources that can help us to develop our appreciation and engagement with a piece of research and to interpret the value of its results. So linking with the idea of searching databases for relevant research papers, you may find a paper that looks like it could be relevant and interesting, but you may be unsure about whether it's worth investing the time to read it. And a review tool is provided by Understanding Health Research. Their website, understandinghealthresearch.org, will help you figure out the value of the paper. It will also help you with the task of developing research literacy. The Understanding Health Research site is a free tool, and it's designed to help you triage the potential of a piece of published health research. The tool guides you through a series of questions to ask about the paper, and when all the questions have been answered and submitted, you'll be sent a summary of your answers and an evaluation about the validity and reliability of the research. It also includes help to understand key research concepts. One of the best ways of developing research literacy is by taking part in a research journal club. Lots of healthcare institutions organise their own journal club, but you may be interested to join the quarterly, actually soon to become monthly, online Chaplains Journal Club, organised jointly by the College of Healthcare Chaplains and the Free Churches Group. For each session, participants are led to a pre-selected paper, which is introduced by a facilitator before being opened up to participants in the group to discuss. Some of the previous papers, the past articles, are available on the research page of the CHC website. This is building into quite a useful resource for research literacy, and to facilitate chaplaincy teams who may want to run their own journal club. Some of the introductions to the past papers have been recorded and are available as videos again on the college website. Some opportunities do exist to gain research literacy. Transforming Chaplaincy offers 2 online, what they call asynchronous courses that are aimed at developing research literacy. Research Literacy 101 is a 5-week introductory course designed specifically for chaplains, and Research Literacy 102 is a 10-week deeper exploration, again specifically designed for chaplains. Both of the courses have been reviewed in the UK Chaplains Research Digest in the autumn 21 and the spring 22 issues, both of which are available on the college website. And additionally, perhaps less accessible for most of us, Transforming Chaplaincy also offers a Chaplaincy Research Summer Institute in Chicago, which this year will be between the 11th and the 15th of July. A little closer to home, the European Research Institute for Healthcare Chaplaincy, ERIC, has hosted 2 iterations of a week-long summer research programme. The first programme was held in Utrecht in 2019, the second was accessed online only. There may be plans to hold another Summer Research Institute perhaps next year, and if so, the programme will likely follow a similar pattern to previous ones, aimed at introducing participants to chaplaincy-related research and research methods. And the details will be on the ERIC website in due course and in the digest also. And then for those who prefer their information to inform and upskill themselves, there are always books, and there are a few things quite as enticing, I think, as a free book. Hope John's not listening. An invitation to chaplaincy research, Entering the Process, was published by the Templeton Foundation. It's a free book. It can be accessed from the research page of the college website. The editors commissioned a series of introductory articles by leading chaplaincy, spiritual care and psychology researchers aimed at walking aspiring chaplaincy researchers through various aspects of the research process. So the book includes chapters on identifying and overcoming obstacles to chaplaincy research, identifying the research question, choosing research methodologies, and disseminating your research. And although it intends to encourage chaplains to begin engaging actively in their own research, the book does serve to build research literacy because it has chapters on evaluating qualitative and quantitative research. If you're interested in developing knowledge about how to think statistically, I would very warmly recommend this small book by Derek Rowntree. It is excellent. Its title is Statistics Without Tears, An Introduction for Non-Mathematicians. It could have been written for me. Rowntree was a founding educator with the Open University, and he understood how people learn from books. And he walks his readers step by step through the logic that underlies what are at times confusing numbers, and he uses plain English to unpack the statistical concepts. It is an excellent introduction. So, okay, we've discovered that we're already researchers, and we've thought about where to find good quality research and ways to develop research literacy. I want to end with a research informing practice case study. This is a research journey that's impacted, in a modest way, my own chaplaincy practice, and hopefully the interdisciplinary spiritual care at the hospice where I work, Princess Alice Hospice in Esher. So, during the early 1990s, a small group of researchers at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, led by George Fitchett, became interested in understanding more about those patients who wanted to receive a visit from a chaplain. The research problem that they were interested in is one that is familiar to all of us: how to allocate scarce chaplaincy resources to ensure their maximum effect. The researchers wanted to understand how chaplains prioritise their visits, and they formulated their research question in this way: how do hospital chaplains and managers of hospital spiritual care departments decide which patients should receive a visit from a chaplain? The researchers were on staff at an urban tertiary care unit, and they were able to recruit a sample of 202 patients to their study. Their research methodology was to have participants complete a short survey conducted as a 10-minute structured interview. And the interviews covered two major areas: aspects of the patient's religious and spiritual lives, and the social support that the patients received, together with any risk factors that might be related to that social support. So having completed the survey, participants were asked if they wanted any or all of 3 spiritual care services: to talk with a chaplain, to have a chaplain pray with them, and or to receive the sacrament of communion. The researchers analysed the data using bivariate test, which is a basic type of statistical analysis designed to examine the associations between variables. In this case, the demographics, the religious and the medical variables. And some of the researchers' findings were unremarkable. For example, the discovery that those who requested spiritual care were likely to be older and non-white. Slightly more interesting perhaps, they found that Jews did not request spiritual care, but that 17% of those who were religiously unaffiliated did request spiritual care. And this last finding notwithstanding, the findings largely confirm the stereotypes about who would be interested in spiritual care. However, using the data, the researchers were able to create variables that allowed them to classify patients into 4 groups according to the potential needs and religious resources. They found that 31% of patients had high levels of spiritual need but low spiritual resources. And in contrast, they found that 35% of patients were highly spiritually resourced with low levels of spiritual need. And that these spiritually highly resourced patients were very likely to be those who were requesting chaplaincy care at the same time as they were receiving spiritual care from their own clergy. And in the light of this, the researchers concluded that identifying those people with high levels of need and low levels of spiritual resources and providing them with spiritual care is more likely to have a measurable effect on their recovery or adjustment to their illness than similar care provided to patients with high levels of spiritual resources. Well, so far, so obvious. But in addressing an answer to their to their research question, how do chaplains and chaplain managers decide which patients should receive a visit from a chaplain, the researchers highlighted the need to develop valid and reliable spiritual screening tools that can identify such patients after an admission. So we spill forward to 2009, and Fitchett and Risk published what became known as the Rush Spiritual Screening Protocol for Spiritual Struggle. The evidence suggests that spiritual struggle could impact on the physical health, the quality of life, and levels of emotional distress. And the Rush Spiritual Screening Protocol is distinctive in that it starts from the premise that simply asking patients whether religion or spirituality is important is likely to elicit a negative response, which non-chaplain members of the healthcare team are likely, very likely, to misinterpret as a lack of interest in religion or spirituality. It always amazes me that they ask, is religion important to you? Would you like to see a chaplain? But they don't ask, is mobility important to you? Would you like to see a physiotherapist? So these researchers included a follow-up question for those who said that religion and spirituality was unimportant. Was there ever a time when religion and spirituality was important to you? And Fitchett and Risk suggest that a shift in the patient's interest could be a potential red flag for a religious or spiritual struggle, warranting a more depth assessment by a chaplain. So these researchers reported several difficulties in evaluating the screening tool. However, in those situations where the tool was applied correctly, the spiritual screening protocol did identify a small number, about 7% of patients, as potentially experiencing spiritual or religious struggle. Now, at some point, I came across this tool and I started using it in teaching sessions with our hospice nurses and created this little aid memoir as a card that they could carry with them. I've never subscribed to the idea that nurses should undertake spiritual assessments, and it's a responsibility, it seems to me, of trained spiritual care specialists, in other words chaplains. But I do accept the idea that healthcare colleagues can triage spiritual distress. However, whenever I suggest it, problematic, is spirituality or faith important to you as you cope with your illness? What made them, and I have to say me, uncomfortable was the way it conflated religion and spirituality into one thing, which is typical amongst US chaplains, but for us in the UK, it reinforced the misunderstandings amongst patients and healthcare colleagues that spiritual care can be reduced to religious care. The good news was that Fit, Check and Risk Protocol was not the only spiritual screening tool show in town. And for several years, Karen Steinhauser, with a team at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, had been working on a project that led eventually to a single item screening tool. Steinhauser's project originated in a qualitative study which researchers asked bereaved family members and healthcare providers to discuss what they thought a good and a bad death might look like. The study found positive end-of-life experiences were frequently associated with having come to peace or being at peace. For many of the respondents, peacefulness related to a religious notion of being at peace with God, but for a number of other people it was a non-theological sense of tranquility, perhaps related to a decision about continuing with chemotherapy, resolution of a conflict with a family member, or a spiritual reflection on the meaning of their illness. And in subsequent research, Steinhauser and her colleagues found that items measuring peacefulness were highly correlated with having the chance to say goodbye, making a positive difference in the lives of others, giving to others in time, gifts and wisdom, having someone with whom to share their deepest thoughts, and having a sense of meaning in their lives. In other words, peacefulness was strongly associated with assessing emotional and spiritual well-being. Steinhauser and her team concluded that as a construct, peacefulness could serve as a brief, non-threatening way to elicit a patient's or a family's concern. And in their final cross-sectional quantitative study, Steinhauser and her team tried to understand what elements of patient experience this single item might be tapping into. Their study involved 248 patients who each completed a bank of psychometric instruments aimed at assessing the quality of life at the end of life, along with patient social support. The team's analysis showed that peacefulness was most strongly associated with the emotional and spiritual well-being subscales. In particular, they found a significant association between feeling at peace and both faith and a sense of purpose, suggesting that both religious and meaning-making components of spirituality might have similar resonance. Steinhauser and her team concluded that the concept of patient's sense of being at peace may be a point at which a conversation about emotional and spiritual concerns could be initiated in a non-threatening and non-sectarian manner. This is where the work of the Steinhauser team has application in practice, and where I've been encouraging our clinicians to use the question, "Are you at peace?" Or some similar kind of wording. Because as Steinhauser's team suggests, the language a person uses in responding to the question can reveal their emotional and or their spiritual frame of reference. And if clinicians can hear that frame of reference, then they may be able to open a conversation and identify spiritual struggle. For example, if a patient's response connotes a spiritual frame, something like, "I used to have a strong faith, but now I feel that God is punishing me," the clinician might ask whether the person would find it helpful to talk to someone who might understand their beliefs. They may also inquire whether the person was linked to a faith community of belief. Again, if the patient responds using an emotional frame of reference, the clinician might explore their mood, their emotional well-being, and again might offer the person somebody to talk with. This single item evidence-based instrument, which Steinhauser and a team developed, addresses the research problem posed by Fitchett and his team about how chaplains can identify spiritually needy people soon after admission. As such, it's a tool that I advocate in my teaching with the colleagues at the hospice. So returning to my colleague who just wanted to be with people who were sick and dying and represent to them the love of Christ in their time of need. Well, as I say, it's hard not to be sympathetic to that statement. It's also hard not to see his perspective as atomistic and isolationist, ignoring the fact that he is actually part of a multi-professional healthcare team and just wanting to get on with a form of spiritual care practice which comes from a bygone era. Even Norman Orton, who represents that bygone era, in many ways epitomised the chaplain as priestly sacrament minister, taught that the chaplain works in a healing partnership with doctors and nurses. The point, and it's an important point I think, is not that we should all become research active. That's not realistic. But that we should all become research aware, or as George Fitchett and Transforming Chaplaincy say, research literate. We need to be able to access, interpret and apply the latest and the best research in our field. So I want to end by summarising with 3 points. First is that we are all already researchers. We intuitively understand the research process. Research is finding stuff out, and we do that every day. Secondly, there are some good resources available to help us find and understand good quality spiritual care research. So have fun exploring and formalise your intuitive knowledge. And thirdly, the point of becoming research literate is not an end in itself. The point of research literacy is to improve our practice such that it will improve the care that we give to our patients. The added bonus is that accessing and understanding and applying evidence-based spiritual care will equip us to communicate what we do in the kind of evidence-based language that those who pay for our service can understand and respect. Thank you.